Outlander is the time-travelling drama set during the American War of Independence, where all kinds of crazy stuff is happening recently. Episode 712, Carnal Knowledge, starts where we left off with Jamie pretending to kidnap Lord John, whisking him this way and that throughout the town. Luckily, they manage to get out of town with pretty much no problems, and then it's only out in the woods that John finally breaks down and tells him that he's had carnal knowledge of his wife. And considering that John's gay and that Claire's trustworthy, Jamie does the sensible thing and assumes it's all a bit of a joke. But gradually he starts to take it a bit more seriously, and then he full-on punts John in the coupon, which leads to a bit of a crap fight, but then some random rebels show up and take John away for questioning, and Jamie's like, "Aye, fine, take the wife shagging bastard." And of course, they find a letter in his pocket because he's got Jamie's jacket on, I think, and that means, well, it means he's up shit creek because the letter says that he's a soldier and a spy, or so they decide anyway. Jamie, on the other hand, goes off to meet that Welsh guy and George Washington.
6'20", fucking killing for fun.
Remember him? He was in the show a few seasons ago. Anyway, he wants Jamie to be a general in the army because, I don't know, dead men's shoes and Jamie being the king of men, I suppose.
He'll save children, but not the British children.
Meanwhile,
Claire and William have a bit of a heart-to-heart, observing that Riley, no matter what, she is still technically his stepmother from either side. And she ends up spilling the beans all about his parentage and what happened, and he has a bit of a fit and ends up taking it out on the prop department. And he's really in a bad mood, so he heads off to like a random whore house in town, and then he's all like, "I'm a bastard," and she's like, "That's cool, works for me." But he's still in a bit of a fragile ego mood, so when she laughs at him, he ends up breaking more props and then gets kicked out because basically he's kind of crap at being this bad boy that he wants to be. And he ends up bumping into Ian and Quaker Oats Lassie, who tell him that they're engaged, and he congratulates them and then kind of stiffly walks away, but then punts Ian in the coupon, as you do. And that turns into fisticuffs, and Ian ends up getting arrested for punching an officer. And luckily, passing Jamie tells him off, and he's like, "But Dad," and then lets Ian go. And after that, he's back off to the pub with his mates, the soldiers, and they're all chatting about a bit of non-consensual bum sex. And finally, he's like, "Okay, enough." And he books the lassie from earlier, who doesn't look particularly pleased, presumably because she thinks she's about to get her back door knocked in. But actually, he's all about apologising about everything. He wants to be noble or something, and also maybe wants to spare himself getting the pox. But she's kind of impressed and tells him that her real name's Jane and lets him kip in the bed beside her. And he's like, "That's fine, we'll not do anything, you can just have the night off." But she's like, "Well, I'm kind of frisky now," and kisses him, which is probably against the house rules. But then, anyway, it's over in a flash, and William ends up experiencing post-shag regret. Lord John, on the other hand, he's been wheeked off to the rebel base, where the dude in charge is actually an old associate of his, and they chat about how General Wayne might want to have him hanged as a message to everybody else, and Washington might want to keep him alive as a political pawn. Also, his eye's a bit buggered up after being punched in the face by Jamie, and luckily, the Quaker Doc is there, because, there's only about 20 people living in America according to this show, and he says, "Well, urine isn't very good, but you'll need an eye patch, and if only Claire was here, because only Claire could future surgery that fracture, because, Jamie's manhand did so much damage to it." And then he ends up slipping him an escape knife and tells him to get went because General Wayne's going to arrive and hang him bad the next day. So in the middle of the night, he does a quick cut on the rope and then ducks and dives bullets all the way into the woods. And back at Casa Lord John, Jamie arrives with absolutely no issues at all, and him and Claire have a bit of an awkward conversation. And after she explains a bit, he's a bit thoughtful, and then he's like, "So did you guys do the bum sex?" And Claire ends up kind of offended, which technically isn't a denial. And he's kind of annoyed by that, and he's like, "Well, you're a bit of a drunken shagger," and she's kind of offended by that as well, and they talk more, and then, well, this is Outlander, so as you've probably guessed, they end up having a bit of a bonk, because a bit of nookie solves a myriad of ills in this show. So what did I think? Well, I'm not going to sugarcoat this at all. I did not like this episode particularly, but I will try and focus on the positives where I can. Now, interestingly, there obviously wasn't any Roger or Bree this week, and I get that because this week was all about the drunken sexcapades of Claire and John and William's revelation of his bastardic parenthood, but I was actually kind of impressed with William's storyline. I thought that Red Dead Redemption bit earlier in the season was interesting, even though it kind of came to a dead end story-wise, but it was nice to follow him for a minute and when he's not soldiering in that, and I thought that, Charles van der Vaart did a great job. I will say, I thought the smashing was excessive, and it did seem a bit weird that Claire was the one telling him about his parentage when really, of anyone involved, it's probably not her story to tell. It would be Jamie or John. But yeah, also it's Claire, and she's going to Claire, isn't she? But anyway, I quite like the idea that he gets upset by this and decides to go off and be a bad guy. And he says, I'm going to get laid. I mean, we don't know about William. I don't recall if he's actually ever slept with anyone. So maybe this is the first time he'd been with a woman. Maybe he goes whoring a lot. Who knows? But anyway, he embarrasses himself and then he lashes out. And then he does the same thing again. But it's only later does he actually try and do the noble thing after he's been told off by his dad. And he sort of succeeds, even if he possibly got AIDS in the process. But anyway, it's interesting to me because, the whole let a prostitute sleep is actually a plot point in 2 other books that I've read. And forgive me, but these are, in my opinion at least, probably better than the book that this show is based on. Those books being one of my all-time favourites, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, where it's kind of a subplot off to the side, and Memories of My Melancholy Whores by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where it's basically the whole plot of the book. But it's a funny one because William does this thing out of a sense of honour, and yet Jane is like, well, you've paid and I have my honour too, which seems both good and bad customer service at the same time, however you want to swing it. But it's also an interesting moment, and I'm guessing because having seen most of 7 seasons of the show, I've got a feel for how things usually go. And I imagine that Claire is going to be a character we're going to see again, possibly a bit more often. Whether she's going to be an ongoing character, it's unclear. But considering Rachel is now engaged to Ian, and that whole side of things seems to be fairly closed off now, William's got nobody to fall awkwardly in love with, so there's a good chance that she's going to be that character, or at least for a while. And there's also a good chance that Captain Buttsex is going to return, because if this show likes one thing, it's a slimy redcoat with a sexual perversion to add a bit of flavour as a minor mid-season villain. Also, I think that David Berry was pretty good this week. He got to do something a bit different for a change, rather than just being, Lord John as this proper upstanding man, or being secretly gay and looking pained and horny at Jamie out of the corner of his eye. And I also thought that the makeup after he'd been beaten up was a really good job. I think that was kind of convincing. It looked like it really hurt. But unfortunately, that's kind of where the trouble comes into Paradise. Because one thing I didn't mention last episode was that I'm not actually sure how William heard Jamie and John in the first place, considering John wasn't talking very loudly.
Your son is due home shortly.
And Jamie was all but whispering.
William.
But even assuming that he did because he's got great hearing, and I kind of get that it would be an earth-shattering revelation, I also didn't mention that Jamie reciting the whole stinking papist thing feels very written. It doesn't feel like something a real person would say. It feels like something a character in a book or a TV show would say because it's a callback to a previous episode or scene. Now, and that's the real thing I've got a problem with this week, because there was so much unreal and dialogue-y dialogue this week, where the show often manages to steer clear of that. And, all TV shows have a bit of that, but it's not usually quite like this. And there was so much of that I found myself thinking again and again, this just doesn't sound like a real conversation. And more than that, it doesn't sound like a real conversation that these characters would have. Especially this.
Had bloody Englishmen bandaged me for his friendship.
And doubly especially this line.
We were both fucking you.
Now the irony here is, and I'm sure some of you are already cracking your knuckles, getting ready to type and tell me that this is all book accurate. And as far as I know from Twitter posts and the like, this is more or less exactly what's said in the book. And that's kind of what the problem is, because I think you can write something in a book, but when you put it on a film, it just doesn't work. And it also sometimes doesn't work because the characters in a TV show are not necessarily exactly the same characters in the book. They will read lines differently, they will put emphasis on different things. Variations and adaptations will change how the characters appear. Also, there was problems this week because there was stuff that felt like it was left unsaid. I mean, just take for example, does Jamie actually know that John married Claire? I don't feel like anybody mentioned that. Maybe I missed a line, but I don't actually remember anybody telling him that. And he never really asked about it. And it feels like that's something that's quite important, even if it is just a marriage that's immediately annulled because it wasn't legal. But at the same time, everyone in this episode is really terrible at explaining anything to each other. And that also follows with the big and rather overlong Jamie and Claire argument scene. And I say overlong not because it's not something that needs time to pay out, because it would, and a real life argument about that would probably go on for some time and through several rooms as it does, but because the argument itself is based on something that I never fully bought into because it seemed ridiculous and contrived, and it feels like it goes in circles in a way that's frustrating as a viewer because you feel like the characters aren't getting anywhere, they're just treading over the same things in ways that make no sense, using dialogue that feels unsatisfying for them to say because they're characters who usually get to the point a lot better. And at this point in the show, I'm starting to feel like the show itself and the script is not respecting my intelligence and my time. To begin with, we all knew that Jamie wasn't dead. We all knew that he'd storm back in at some point, although, as I said, I predicted it would be later in the season, but it feels too fast, too convenient, too neat. Jamie goes missing, just as Claire's suspected of being a spy, and then she just has to marry Lord John right there and then, just after she found out that Jamie died, and then they just happen to get drunk and shag. And then Jamie, of course, happens to turn back up just as the troops are about to burst in, and William walks in just in time to overhear them, and then he's put his coat on John, and the troops take him prisoner, and Jamie happens to just pass William and Ian, and it's coincidence after coincidence after coincidence, and the show didn't used to be like this. Now, I know that they're condensing stuff like crazy because I think there's one more season, which probably means there's maybe only 12 episodes left in this show, or maybe 15, I don't know. And they're trying to fit plots in from books the size of Lord of the Rings, and there's probably like 2 or 3 books still to go. But that turns this into a borderline farce. And I don't begrudge anybody who likes the books and wants to see classic scenes from the books put on screen, verbatim. We're all guilty of that. I mean, hey, I for one own the Hobbit trilogy on Blu-ray, and regardless of how bad those films might be in your opinion, and I think they've got a lot of problems, you would have to prize them from my cold dead hands because you know what? I really like seeing some of those scenes from the books put on film in a really beautiful way. But yeah, for folks like me who don't read the Outlander books, just watch the show, this is turning into utter nonsense. And it's a shame because there are plots and ideas here that could actually be really good television drama, but instead are turning into cheap soap opera writing slapped in the middle of this multi-million-pound TV production. Which, to be honest, is about the most 2020 thing ever, because if you think of some of the other shows that are getting cranked out at the moment that are awful, yeah, it makes sense that Outlander would follow suit. On the smaller side of things, I really wasn't interested about the Ian and Rachel stuff or the punch-up. It felt like filler and an excuse to get William off of the Rachel train. It also, both this week and last, there's some wigs doing a lot of heavy lifting, especially during sex scenes. I mean, neither Jamie, John, nor William seem to have shifted a hair when they were doing the deed this season, which, probably makes life a lot easier for the wig department, but it seems just a little bit unrealistic and a little bit too TV for me. Also, speaking of looking like things, these two guys, they don't look much like Jamie and John to me. I mean, if you're using body doubles, get someone who actually looks like them, or use a digital face replacement, or just film them from further away or from behind, because I was just looking at that and going, that's not them. So where does that leave us now? Well, I mean, I don't know, Jamie doesn't seem to care or really isn't worried about John, which seems a bit silly, because he should know about the note in the pocket, because he literally talked about it. But anyway, John clearly isn't going to die, partly because he's a main cast member and because that would leave Jamie and Claire sad about something because they've done something bad, and I don't see this show doing that. I also don't see this show burying its gays. I also don't see this show killing off Lord John when Diana Gabaldon has written a whole bunch of books just about him. So I imagine that William's going to probably have a punch-up with Captain Buttsex next week, or maybe he'll do something bad and William will have to heroically murder him before the end of the season because, he'll turn into some kind of murder bummer or something, or kidnap Jane. Anyway, that kind of nonsense. And Claire, I mean, I'm just presuming Claire's going to mope about a bit, do some surgery, and decide that she wasn't to blame for anything that happened as usual, and then probably will bump into Lord John just in time to do some critical eye surgery on him that magically won't leave a scar or anything, because TV show. And look, I know I'm being negative, and I wish I could be more positive, but this was a bad episode. The show is really going off the deep end this half of the season. It's turning into a lot of unmitigated waffling nonsense this week, and it can only frankly get better from here, so until next time, these have been my grumpy opinions.